I want to thank everyone for being here. And just so that everyone knows, we're going to have presentations to maybe around 6 or a little bit after. People can make comments from the floor if you'd like, and there will be buses going back to this nest at 6:30. So many thanks for being here for this tribute to Robert Fogel, or Bob, as we learned to call him. I remember when I just got my PhD, and Bob called me into his office, and he said, "You can now call me Bob." And I said, "Thank you, Mr. Fogel." Generous, humane, brilliant, a visionary, thoughtful, humorous, enthusiastic, and an eternal optimist, as all of us know who would give him stuff that we didn't believe in, but he did. A mentor, a teacher, a scholar, a friend, a beacon, and an incredible debater. You never wanted to say no to Bob. So what would our discipline be like had there been no Robert Fogel? That's a very difficult counterfactual. I can't run the complete experiment. I really haven't thought about exactly how to do it. But I do know a couple of things. Number one, there would be no DAE program in the NBER, and therefore there'd be no Summer Institute for the DAE, and so we wouldn't be here. Some of us would not be economic historians. I know I would not have been one. Bob got me to be an economic historian. And we would not have the memories and the stories that we're going to share with you today. Now, Bob was known to most people through his writings this way. Through his writings from railroads. And I put the dates down because I think that they're very interesting. So in 1960, that was the book, the Union Pacific Railroad was the book from his master's thesis at Columbia. And he was 35 years old. And if you're wondering what he did with all the other years, you'll have to read his autobiography. And it goes until this year, when at 88 years old, he wrote Political Arithmetic. And what's interesting is how many books are after 1989. And of course, he won the Nobel in 1993. So that's the way most people know Bob, through all of the writings from railroads to slavery to health and population and demography. But many of us were fortunate to have known him very well. And we're going to have 13 stories of Bob as co-author and teacher and co-teacher and mentor and guide and friend and colleague. And the stories are going to show Bob to have been an immensely humorous and generous person, a hobbyist, and even, in my story, a hippie wannabe. I was the hippie. And I set some rules, and the rules are that each person has no more than 3 minutes, and each one of us could go on for hours, okay? So that's why I said 3 minutes. And each person is to present a true story about Bob, and the story has to be from the heart, and you can't have any notes. Those are the ground rules. Now, we were to begin with Stan, and Stan is back in the hotel, but he did tell me a bit about what he was going to say. part of it was going to be about the beginnings of the DAE. And he was going to talk about how Bob Fogel brought together a group of people, Bob Goldin and Lance Davis and Clayton Pope and me and Stan and himself. And we all had to go to North Carolina to Chapel Hill because at the time Bob Goldin couldn't fly, so we had to go to him. And we went there, and that was the executive committee. And we'd go there, and we would eat, and Bob would record what we were doing, except because he would only record while we were eating, the recordings, all you could hear is the waiters and the dishes. And then the DA was formed, and this group was the executive committee. And every time we would have a meeting, the executive committee would go out and have a really good dinner, okay? And so Stan's story was that when I took over, the executive committee got together without me and said, "There goes the dinner." And Stan said, "There goes the executive committee." Okay. So I'm going to go now to Hoyt, and each person will say what they would like to say, and I just request they stay somewhere between here and here, because that's where I'm focused, and this is for the Bureau website. Okay.
I see you're breaking the rule of no notes.
Well, no,
Can I do that?
That was my...
For the introduction.
That was just the
Oh,
introduction.
I see. Okay, thank you. So the story I want to tell is really a story about stories, because Bob, I think, if you title it, it would be something like "Spinning Yarns for Intellectual Engagement." So it starts with when I first got to Chicago, and I asked for an appointment with then Professor Fogel, as the nomenclature went, and I said maybe a half an hour, and they kind of chuckled at me, the staff at the CP, because I since learned that there are no half-hour meetings with Bob Fogel, because once you get hooked on an interesting topic, the yarns start spinning and spinning, and you find the threads go this way and that way, and they kind of come back together. We've had a number of these meetings over time. Sometimes my wife would call me in the middle of them, and she came to understand I would text her "meeting Fogel," and she knew that meant I probably wasn't coming home for dinner or whatever, right? Because that was just the way these things went. But just a tremendous sense of intellectual engagement I thought when we had these things. And so, we ran a workshop together for the time that we coincided at Chicago, and I got to see some of these stories and how they fit together. And more recently, he wanted to. One thing that I was really impressed about is that he wanted to stay engaged in the classroom with students, with research. Certainly, I think many of us, when we get to our upper 80s, if we're lucky enough to be metabolizing, that's maybe not going to be what we choose to do with our time. But he wanted to do that because for him that was leisure. And it's something that he enjoyed so much, so I had the opportunity towards the end to help him stay in the classroom, and I kind of redesigned the classroom experience to be basically, we get to talk and then he gets to spin his yarns. And I think he didn't actually appreciate how good he was at it, because he spoke to his nurse, Susan, I forget his last name, brought him into the first class, and people, once they get to a certain age, they're not aware of how loud they're talking. And he says in our first class, he says, "Well, come early because I don't think this is going to work out." and so it turns out, I think it worked out pretty well. He said it worked out. But it was one of these things that we started to talk. I forget if I was presenting that day or we had some students presenting that day. And, we get to some point and then the yarns start spinning, right? And everything each time he did this, there was usually this reaction from the classroom and often from me too, where is this going? Right? Because it starts off in this thing, and it comes here, and goes back to it, and eventually you come back to this thing, and it's amazing, like the tapestry that emerged from these yarns that were spun. One example I give that is not the best one, but is the easiest one to relate quickly, is what I came to call the spinach story, which is whenever we got to the subject of life expectancy or healthcare or something like that, we learned that Bob Fogel really liked to eat spinach. And that he would go out, his mother would send him out to the store, he'd buy the spinach, and he'd come back, and he didn't immediately eat it. He said it was actually, he had to spend all this time washing it, because when he was a boy, it was more sand than spinach by weight. And then he says, well, nowadays, all that labor service is bundled with a spinach and all this, and all the students are like, looking at you like, why is he saying this? We're talking about healthcare, right? But it was one of these things that, he would bring this thing that's kind of seeming more orthogonal, but really illustrates a point, and he says, well, healthcare is kind of like that too, because it's like bundling all this stuff that, we look at healthcare expenditure, but we if that's all you do, you sort of miss the quality aspect of it. And so, it was a very, again, that sort of approach to helping you think about things by taking you in 3 different directions and bringing you back was just a sign of a very active and engaged mind, and one that was interested in following questions where they may. That was my time. That's probably my 3 minutes. So
I'm not timing anymore.
Okay. So that's what I'll say. Just to say, it was a real privilege for me to be able to have that experience with him and be in the classroom and again be part of the intellectual engagement, the bundle of intellectual engagement that he was and enthusiasm that he had for inquiry. Thank you.
Probably want to turn on the lights at the overhead light. Turn off the overhead and get that last row of lights on.
Boy, you look really good with words across your
Thank you. Yes.
First.
Might be an improvement.
That,
So, just turn. I just shut the whole thing off. Is that okay? Is this the one that?
is it one of those buttons back there?
Well, yeah, let's just try it.
Hit again. Hit yes again. Hit again. There you go.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay, now we have no idea who's next. We do. It's
Hugh.
Hugh. Here's the grumbler.
Boy, I didn't realize how this would affect me today. So the story I want to tell you is about how I complained about my grade. About Fogel. So I had written a paper, first course, and it was about social rates of return. So there are different ways of computing the social rate of return, and they're all, they each answer a different historical question, so they're all kind of valid, right? And I get the paper back, and it says, this is a publishable paper, Hugh. You should come and see me about this, right? And for me, this was just thrilling, because nobody had ever said anything that nice to me. Right? But then I noticed that the grade is a B. So I went into Bob's office. This was one of the first times that I had really had a conversation with him. And I said, Professor Fogel, do you really think this is a publishable paper? He said, oh, yes, Hugh. There was somebody else who had written something similar, I think in a different semester, and you should work with him and you should write it up as a note for the Journal of Economic History. Right? Wow. So then I said, well, Professor Fogel, I think you made a mistake about the grade, right? You just gave the paper a B. And in this part I remember 100%. He looks at me and he said, Hugh, this is the University of Chicago. We have much higher standards here than they do at the journals. They publish all kinds of crap in the journals, he said. And then to prove it to me, he took an AR off the shelf behind him. He opened up to a paper by a well-known labor economist, and he begins to demolish it. And so for 15 or 20 minutes, the data's no good, the model makes no sense, and then he kind of closes it up. It's all crap. I said, oh, thank you, Professor Fogel. Thank you.
Okay. So my story takes place in the spring of 1970. and I have been working on my work on urban slavery. And I realized that I should go to the archives, to Chapel Hill, to the Southern Historical Collection, and really do the real work, not just sit in the library and read papers from, newspapers from Richmond, Virginia. And so, in addition, I learned that Bob and Stan were working on a project. It was a pretty big project, and it had something to do with slavery, but I wasn't quite certain what. And they also wanted stuff from the archives. So it was determined that I would go first. And so Bob said to Marilyn, get her a plane ticket. And so Marilyn got me a plane ticket. And I went there. And then I came back. And I walked into Bob's office, and as everyone who knows him knows, he was sitting down, and he had a big smile. He had a Cheshire grin smile, like from ear to ear. And I walked in, and he greeted me warmly, and he said, before we discuss what you found, did you give Marilyn all your receipts? And I said, I don't have receipts. I didn't know anything about receipts. He said, that's okay, we can deal with that. And just tell her what you spent money on. I said, well, I didn't spend money on anything. And he looked at me like I was crazy. Because after all, he had this big NSF grant. What was I doing not spending money? And he said, well, where did you stay? At Duke. I said, well, I used a word that some of you may know. I said, I crashed on the floor of this guy's house, and he wasn't there, but he was the boyfriend of a woman I know who has an Irish setter. He said, okay. He said, but how did you get to Chapel Hill? Because I started at Duke. I said, oh, it was pretty simple. You take the 147, you transfer, you go to the 15. And he said, oh, that's good. So where's the car receipt? I said, I hitched. and I could see he looked both frightened and perplexed. And then he didn't know where to go from there. And then he said, well, but where did you stay? In Chapel Hill. I could see he was a little fearful of what I was going to say. I said, oh. I said, I walked into the Southern Historical Collection, and I saw a researcher, a woman, and I said, well, where should I stay? And she said, you must stay with me. And she had an apartment, and it faced a garden, and it was just beautiful, and the archives closed at 5:30, so a group of us went bowling every night. And then we had pizza. And I could see in his eyes, as many of us know, there was this twinkle. The radical in him had reappeared, and he was the hippie wannabe. And then he said to me, with the twinkle, he said, Stan is going to go to the archives next. Why don't you call him and tell him what to do? I never again went to an archive on Bob's nickel, as he would have said, without him renting me a car and getting a hotel room. And we go to Rick Steckel, who's going to talk about Bob as guide to the world of empiricism.
Well, as someone who's known Bob almost as long as Claudia, my meeting was in the spring of '71, and I was at the end of my first year as a graduate student at Chicago, having transferred from the University of Oklahoma. I spent a few years there because I was an economics major who had no mathematics, and a history minor, liked both fields, but I had a good mentor. He said, look, if you want to get a PhD and become a professor, go to some school, take a lot of math, statistics, some econ, transfer to one of the major graduate programs. So that's what I did. Took a lot of math and actually almost became a mathematician. At least was offered a fellowship at George Stigler had come down to Norman to give a talk. I knew his son while I was at Oberlin, and we used to shoot pool Saturday nights. And so we got talking about that experience and applying to Chicago. We said, sure, apply to Chicago, come on up. Well, he turned out to be my advisor for 4 years, where he signed my course assignment offering sheet. And anyway, I needed a job, so I, like all graduate students, I committed a lot of skills in programming and math and so on, and asked around where could I work. And someone said, well, there's this guy, Bob Fogel, who has, big projects going forward. Why don't you ask him? So I went over and made an appointment, and he was in this little tiny office in the main office. I know Claudia knows, and Marilyn was tucked away in a tiny cubicle next to that. And so I go in and say hello, and he has a tape recorder going. He tape records this conversation with me. What is he going to do with my words? I'd already heard about the railroad work and before Fogel and after Fogel, the FAF, all that stuff. He says, why does he want to know anything about me? But anyway, it goes on for some half an hour. I have 2 projects, a principles book and a slavery book. And the principles book is going to be totally different because it's going to be more inductive than deductive. And I'm going to organize all the data around empirical evidence that's going to lead to some generalizations, very much in the Kuznets tradition. And then there's this slavery book. And well, gee, that sounds interesting too. What should I do? It wasn't quite like flipping a coin in my mind, but I went for the slavery book. Okay, go over to the library and start reading all the works you can find by Hubie Phillips. Now, I thought he said Hubie. H-U-B-I-E. And there are people named Hubie, but I couldn't find him in the library. And I was too fearful of going back to ask him. So I went through all the Phillipses in the card catalog until I found ones that dealt with slavery. And it was Ulrich Brunel, of course. And started reading them and would report back to him regularly on what I had found and what I thought of that interpretation of the past. And it went on from there. We met on regular basis, every week or two, had long conversations, not only about this work, but about Simon Kuznets and the empirical tradition, which is, he's very much descended from Simon Kuznets in his approach. There's just, you can see it straight through in this book. But I will tell you, because we had Kuznets stories too, that came out of these kinds of conversations. The first time he met Simon Kuznets, well, Simon didn't have a tape recorder, but Bob had come in with a proposal for work on railroads. And in there, there was a suggestion on how to calculate commodity flows between regions. And he gave Kuznets a 2-page summary. He looked at it for 10 seconds and then started grilling it. So he read the whole thing in 10 seconds, which Bob was always stunned at Fogel's, Kuznets' capacity there. He looked up at him and said, you propose one way to estimate commodity flows between regions. There are 3 others. When you figure out what they are, come back and see me.
So is Tom.
Well, listening to the dates that Claudia and you, Rick, have mentioned, I may actually have known Bob longer, but not nearly as well, because I was neither a student nor a co-author. I would just run into him, and then, of course, got involved with the DAE, and he talked me into doing some things. I don't remember the exact date I met him for the first time, but I do remember the second time, for some reason, namely that he seemed to remember me from the first time, and said, oh, Tom, come over here and meet these people. So I remember him better than, or he remembered me better than I remembered our first meeting at that time. But in any case, even though I was not one of the students, I came up with a small story about his interest in teaching and his generosity, well, to me, at least. Because back in the 80s, I was an advisor in the undergraduate honors program at the University of Kansas, and we were each given 10 to 15 students that we were advisors for at least 2 years. If they needed more help, we were there for 4 years. And our chief responsibility, however, was to offer them a tutorial, semester-long tutorial in their first year, either the fall or the spring semester. It was supposed to be on a topic that we thought would not be part of their regular freshman curriculum, kind of open their mind to new things, and, if possible, introduce them to your discipline. Well, I didn't think an economics tutorial would be all that interesting in the evening for these students, so I gave them a tutorial on economic history. And I thought, well, why not have them see what a traditional historian thinks about slavery, and then what new work on Time on the Cross is all about. So I had them read U.B. Phillips, Life and Labor in the Old South, and Time on the Cross. And then I thought, well, it'd be great if I could get Bob or Stan to come down and meet with these students. So I talked to Bob about coming down and giving a seminar to the economics department, and then meeting with these students informally. And he, to my surprise, I thought I was just politely going to ask Bob and then revert to Stan. At this point, I was unaware of Bob's generosity and these sorts of things. So he said, "Oh, I'd be delighted to come down." And I think he wanted to come down because I had offered him the opportunity to talk to some undergraduates. Now, I hadn't yet met the undergraduates, and when I did, I had some misgivings about it. I have less misgivings now after having heard the stories about it being a hippie wannabe and mischief with Stan and so on. But they were kind of a mixed group. Half of them belonged in the honors program and the other half didn't. They were mixed culturally and socially. Most noticeably, there was a small contingent that probably every other week would come in with long earrings hanging from their ears and their noses, and sometimes wearing chains. And I thought, well, this may not go over so well with Bob or other faculty members. Didn't bother me, because I knew what they were up to. This class, it turns out to be on their way to whatever else they were going to do that evening. And in this case, for this group, they were on their way to some place called the Outhouse, which was Lawrence, Kansas's venue for alternative rock music. And since my daughter was an alternative rock musician at the time, I knew what this was all about and thought, that's fine, you can do that. But I didn't know if Bob would put up with that. So anyway, he does come down and meets with the students, and they had cleaned up their act. They all are typical college freshmen, I guess. And then I had to go teach a class, so here I am telling you about his impact as a teacher without ever having had a classroom and without actually having watched him teach these kids. But now, from hearing just these few other anecdotes, I can see what happened. Anyway, he talked with them for about an hour, picked him up afterwards, and he said, "Gee, I thought that went pretty well. Kind of an interesting bunch of kids, and I think we got along okay." And so the short-run impact of his talking to his kids was the next meeting they were much more interested in the subject. The previous 4 or 5 weeks, I'm like trying to pull teeth. Well, what do you think about Phillips's view on this or that or the other thing? Oh, Phillips thing. Anyway, after having talked to Bob, they're kind of prepared, and then when we got to Time on the Cross, they're like almost eager to talk about things. Chafing at the bit was the way I thought about it at the time. A little bit of it was because some of them were science majors, and they were really interested. But in any case, so clearly he had an impact on the larger group of students. In the longer run, he also had an impact. 6 or 7 years later, by which time most undergraduates have forgotten who their instructors were. Certainly don't remember some guy who came in and talked to them for an hour. I get a letter from one of the students with a news clipping saying, "I think this was the guy that talked to us back in 1985. Did you know he won the Nobel Prize?" And I wrote back and thanked him for that. So I thought, this is amazing. I have no idea whether any of my students remember me 6 or 7 years later, and they're remembering this guy. Obviously, this guy remembered me enough to send me the message. So after that, when I started thinking that maybe this would be a different view of Bob Fogel, and that might be the story I tell, I tracked this kid down, but no longer a kid, he's a professor at Ohio State now, said, given that you remembered Bob Fogel and the Nobel, you might be interested in this, unfortunately. And he wrote back and said, thanks for sending that. He said, you know, I still have fond memories of that experience. And so I thought that was kind of the perfect comment, because I think we all have fond memories of our experiences with Bob.
Okay, I was not one of Bob's students, but I was certainly a student of Bob's for almost 40 years. I had the good fortune to meet him at an economic history seminar, probably in spring of 1973, and I spoke very briefly with him, and about maybe 3-4 weeks later, I received this big package in the mail, which was a typescript of Time on the Cross. And it's kind of like, what the hell am I going to do with this? Then I realized I should read it. And that was the first true all-nighter that I ever pulled in my life. I got so engrossed reading Time on the Cross in manuscript form that I stayed up all night, and I finished about 4 o'clock in the morning. And reading that, like Claudia, it changed my career choices, it changed my life. Now, I never have worked on anything that Bob worked on until I got involved with the railroads. But despite that, Bob was always interested in whatever one was doing. He was always, he always had really great, helpful comments to make. He pointed out how naive and misinformed you were on many of these things. He would kind of fix you with that gaze of his, but he would always soften his harsh commentary with the smile and the little laugh that he had. But Bob, was both a big data person and a small data person. And I think the thing that I have carried away from my experiences with Bob, aside from the generosity that people have talked about and his willingness to comment on anything, is the importance of a single number. And I guess that's Bob, the statistician, that a single number can in fact tell a story. But Bob was generous. He taught me a lot. He continues to teach me a lot, and we miss him.
Thank you.
So many people here know that I have a life outside of economics. I'm a musician. Nowadays, I mostly play classical music, but when I was in graduate school at Harvard studying with Bob, I was a jazz guitarist. And I played gigs on occasion with a friend of mine who was a pianist. He was a PhD student in philosophy, and we would play in the area. For example, we played at the original Legal Seafoods in Union Square. Another time we played a gig at one of the Harvard houses. In that particular gig, we had a bass player. He was an African-American guy in his 50s, and I could tell from the moment he started playing that I was way out of my league. So was my pianist friend. And that was because our bass player used to play with the Count Basie Orchestra. So I sounded a lot better that gig than I normally did. And we were playing, I think, a Duke Ellington piece, Take the A Train. And I looked up, and there was Bob Fogel. He was listening, and he was snapping his fingers. So I talked with him during the break, and he told me that he had seen Count Basie in Harlem in the 1940s, and I didn't have the presence of mind at the time to realize that that must have been when he was courting his wife. Right? I mentioned this, Claudia put up interest in music. That's not what this is about. It's about interest outside of economics. We think of Bob as the great workaholic as the saying goes, the hardest working man in show business. You know, the story is that when he won the Nobel Prize, when he got the phone call at 5:30 in the morning, he had already been up for an hour and a half working. And he was a really, hard-working guy. But he had interests outside economics. And his interests were at an extremely high level. He was a woodworker of great skill, almost professional, I would say professional level. He was a photographer with great skill, also almost at professional level. I want to make 3 points about this. The first is, and this is for younger people in the audience, it might be, you might think that the time that you spend away from your computer is not a good idea, because of course you could be writing another article. I remember an interview with a member of our group who's not here, who was asked, when this person was an assistant professor, what her hobbies were. And her answer was, assistant professors have no hobbies. I hope that's not the case. I think these things enrich us, and they especially enrich us in economic history, because we bring our humanity outside of the science to what we do. In Bob's case, there's something else that I want to say about this, in that if I think about what he really was about and what was special about it, it wasn't the counterfactual, it wasn't the technical things, it was the architecture. All right? He had big ideas in mind and big projects, but he always could see the architecture of it, could see the beginning, the middle, the end, the overview. If you're playing a piece of music, you have to have the architecture. If you don't have the architecture, it's just the connection of notes. It doesn't mean anything. But he had the architecture. And if you saw one of the tables that he made in his house, you can see that that was there, where it came from. Because you can't make a table that, is a work of art unless you have the architecture. Unless you get the details right, everything has to be in its place. And that, for me, is really what I got from him. I didn't emulate him so much in my own work as to see that, to see the architecture, and to put it together just like a craftsman makes a chair. Thank you.
Michael? Gordon?
Breaking the rules.
Oh.
Well, I first met Bob Fogel in September 1965 when I entered the graduate program at the University of Chicago, and I was enrolled in his course in American Economic History. I think it was called Economics 318. And I just arrived at Chicago from LSE, where I did my master's degree. And the lasting impression that I had of Bob was his warm and generous nature. And I had a hard time adjusting to the graduate program at Chicago after two wonderful and not too stressful years in London. I think I saw 45 plays when I was there, and also cheap back then. Especially challenging to me at Chicago was the money macro sequence of the core that we all had to take. Okay, and I'd been immersed in Keynesian economics at McGill, and then in Canada, and then LSE, and I had teachers like Jack Weldon and Bill Phillips, and I found it really hard learning how to think in terms of a quantity theory of money as taught by Milton Friedman. I also had a hard time, and the old veterans from Chicago will remember this from that time. I had a hard time with the cutthroat, competitive atmosphere of Chicago, with creepy characters around like Houston Stokes and Wyatt Mankin. I think maybe Claudia might remember, and Hugh. And these guys are looking, and they're offering to sell me copies of previous year's core exams, okay, and trying to steal my class notes. So into this atmosphere of terror and anomie stepped Bob Fogel into my life. So his 318 course was really fascinating to me. It gave me the feeling that maybe Chicago would be okay. And when I first signed up for the class, And back then, economic history and history of economic thought were required courses for the PhD. I had no idea that I would get hooked into economic history. I mean, I had these plans from LSE that I studied, I think it was called advanced economic theory. So I had these sort of thoughts that I'd end up in this stratosphere of economics. So in addition to Bob's course being such a treat, he was the only professor at Chicago who was accessible. His door was always open, and he didn't have a formidable secretary sort of blocking the way. He had Marilyn, but she was sort of on the side, so you could just walk right in. And I used to just drop by and schmooze with Fogel and talk about my doubts about my future at Chicago and about economic history. I'd talk about economic history. So I'd go in there just as the others said. I'd stand up just to say hello, and I'd be there for like 45, 50 minutes. So what happened, of course, is I continued on in Chicago. I didn't quit and go back to England. And I took a second course in American Economic History, Econ 319, and then I took the Economic History prelim. I also overcame my fear of the quantity theory of money, and I ended up writing my dissertation in U.S. monetary history with Milton Friedman, with Bob Fogel on the committee. So I mean, I don't really have a story to tell about Bob. I couldn't really remember any of those funny stories, but Bob really inspired me, both to stick it out at Chicago and to become an economic historian. And his warmth, generosity, and enthusiasm for his research and for economic history is what I will always remember.
Thanks.